So we're going to give folks a couple minutes to join in, and then we'll get started. So just hold tight, and we'll get rolling. If you want a little reading in the meantime, I dropped a couple documents in our little handout section of GoToWebinar here, so you can take a look at that while we wait for the rest of the folks to join. So we'll just give it a minute here. Thanks. All right, we got a few more folks rolling in. So again, we'll just give it a couple minutes. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll be getting started in just a minute here. All right, we'll give it one more minute, and I promise we'll get started. Don't want people to miss the exciting stuff at the part where I tell you all about how the recordings can be sent out early. All right, I think that's enough time giving people to log in. So we'll get started here. So hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar with Lookout. We're going to be talking about the dangers of APTs in the enterprise, discussing what security teams need to know. So I'll be going over just a few logistics here. My name is Hank Schless. I'm Director of Global Security Campaigns here at Lookout. And I'll be kind of sort of hosting the session. We've got Justin and Christina here who we'll introduce in a second. But just a couple of quick logistical things. We will be sending out the recording for this within the next day or so after today. So keep an eye out for that, and then obviously share it with anybody who you think would find it interesting, whether that's sort of within your organization, within your network, anything like that. The other thing is that we're going to host this very much as a discussion. I have a slide up now. There are going to be a couple points where I pop up a slide as we're going through our conversation, but for the most part, Justin, Christina, and I will be just on camera talking roundtable. So I really encourage people to ask questions in that questions panel. We'll leave some time at the end to get to them. We also don't have any prepared ahead of time, so if there aren't any, then we'll just end the session. But we obviously would love to get some feedback from the crowd or some questions rather on what we're going to discuss here. Yeah, let's do some quick introductions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see all of our smiling faces. And all right, so as I mentioned, Hank Schless, Director of Global Security Campaigns. I have Christina Balaam and Justin Albrecht here with me. Guys, why don't you do a quick intro about yourselves? Christina, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi. So I am on the threat intelligence team at Lookout. I've been here for a little over 5 years. Prior to this, I came from more of an application security background, so kind of got into threat intelligence once I actually joined Lookout. But yeah, most of my focus kind of comes from a software engineering background, and so this has been a really exciting change towards kind of more of this threat intelligence analysis and threat hunting and all of that since I joined Lookout. Yeah, I can't believe it's now been over 5 years ago. Time has flown.
Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, I think you have me just beat, I think. So game on. Justin, what about you?
So I joined Lookout a little over 4 years now. I'm the director of mobile threat intelligence here. Prior to Lookout, I worked at the NSA as a federal contractor and in the US military for about 18 years. I started out in counterterrorism actually as an Arabic linguist and then switched to cybersecurity during my career there. And here, I'm mostly responsible for working with our customers on how they can use our threat intelligence and doing research as well, kind of defining those intelligence requirements and working with our TI team, like Christina.
Awesome. Well, two people that are very good to have on when we're talking about APTs here. So just a real quick overview of the agenda. The first thing we'll do is kind of level set on APT or advanced persistent threat groups. We're going to kind of talk about how these groups have evolved over the last number of years, undefined period of time, but we'll go through that, and then we'll start moving into sort of how that affects the enterprise. One thing we'll discuss is sort of how APTs were more traditionally thought of in the more kind of nation state cyber espionage type realm and how that's shifting. And then we're actually going to go over at the end. Justin and Christina discovered some pretty cool mobile surveillanceware tied to APT 41 earlier I guess that was actually just, a month or two ago. So we'll go through that. They'll take us through their discovery of it. And actually we'll have Christina take us through the Lookout Research Console and show how you might find something like this using the console. So get a little demo at the end there. So as I mentioned, we're doing this totally conversation style. There will only be the occasional slide, I promise, mostly just for giving people something to look at. So let's get started here. So Christina, I'll start with you. We're talking about APTs. Why don't you give folks a little bit of just an overview of what they are, from your perspective, why they're important, et cetera.
Sure, yeah. So APTs, that acronym stands for Advanced Persistent Threats. We typically think of them as sophisticated cyber groups that are often controlled or sponsored by nation states. And we typically see them use a few different types of techniques as part of their campaigns, usually in tandem with each other. So things like deploying custom malware, social engineering attacks, using zero or end-day exploits. Typically that's for the more well-funded folks. We don't see that as much with all APT groups. Those are kind of saved for the upper echelon that really have access to those resources and a lot of money. And then for cyber espionage purposes and sometimes for financial gain as well. So yeah, their objectives kind of range a bit. So sometimes it's something like a campaign that's attempting to gain unauthorized access to an organization's network, or stealing, say, valuable intelligence or intellectual property, injecting malicious code into a company's product, or conducting targeted surveillance on an individual or a particular group of individuals. I think that last example is what we typically see or typically think of in the context of like your like standard nation state sponsored activity. Is a lot of espionage and targeted surveillance.
Absolutely. And Justin, I'll toss it over to you for this one. You mentioned your background, having been in this for a while. How have you kind of seen these groups evolve a bit over kind of your career?
So yeah, it's definitely been interesting, and I'll focus in on mobile because when I first started and we started looking at APT groups at Lookout, at the time we were tracking a decent number of APT groups using mobile malware when I joined. I want to say it was in probably the low dozens. Since then, we've seen a lot of adoption across various APTs that are typically associated with desktop malware that are deploying mobile tooling. And we've also seen some changes in their tactics. So one thing that I think we'll discuss later when we're looking at the hunting portion is APT tooling, like Christina mentioned, is often custom. We do see the use of what we call commodity malware. So if you're familiar with desktop malware, you might be familiar with tools like NJRAT or Redline Stealer. These are commonly available tools that people can get off the dark web or GitHub and then deploy against targets. We have seen APTs using those similar tools on mobile, so things like SpyNote or Omith in their campaigns. But typically, what we're seeing a trend of is leaning more towards customized tooling, modularity within that tooling, and then a change in tactics where there's still a heavy reliance on social engineering, because that seems to be the key way that by and large most of these organizations get to targets. But at the same time, they've come up with some very unique tricks for bypassing the protections on mobile devices and on the application stores as well, where sometimes the mobile malware is hosted, and doing things like setting up their own like complete chat services that are functional with web pages and support, while at the same time collecting sensitive data on targets. So we've seen, I guess they're getting more sophisticated, even at what we consider low level or mid level actors.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that, like you said, a little bit later on. But it's almost like a trickle down effect, if you will, where the I'm gonna put on my screen here. So where the the less sophisticated groups are kind of, it seems like almost copycatting a little bit what the more advanced groups are doing. I mean, from a tactics perspective, you mentioned a couple things there, Justin, but I don't know if you guys maybe have like one or two changes, evolutions you've seen happen, or maybe sort of a favorite tactic you've seen these groups take on over the last couple of years in particular.
I have one that's really interesting that came out from a North Korean group. It's a Kimsuki, and they had a technique that was highlighted. I think now this was a few months ago, but where essentially if they had the credentials of a Gmail account of one of their targets, what they could do is create a developer profile within Google Play. So this allowed them to create test applications. The original design for this is to deliver applications to your own company. So like similar with Apple, we see this with iOS malware as well, where an organization will have a profile, an enterprise profile that they use. Perhaps they get the UDIDs from an Apple device, they add it to that profile, and then they kind of can internally deliver malware to devices within an organization, right? Or in a legitimate context, you're a company, you develop apps and you send them to your employees for testing. So what this North Korean group was doing was they were using this functionality on Android to create these test applications using these developer profiles, and then they were putting the Gmail credentials for the victims within that list of these are the users for these applications that are actually malware, and then syncing the malware directly to the devices using the Google Play mechanism for syncing apps to these devices. So all they needed in essence was Google credentials in order to do what's essentially a zero-click attack. And what I think is cool is like with that, they were typically spear phishing the targets originally to get the Gmail credentials. This could be on email or on the mobile device or whatever. But of course, you could also get those from a breach. Like if you had breach data, are you doing password spraying, or you had some other method for getting those credentials. It's a really easy way to land malware on Android devices without any kind of user interaction whatsoever.
That's interesting. Yeah, the zero click part is pretty interesting. I feel like we mostly, again, to your point, see that like pretty advanced stuff. I mean, the first one that comes to mind for me, obviously, is Pegasus and deploying that way. But that's interesting. Christina, what about you? Any favorite bad guy tactics?
I don't know so much about tactics. I mean, I'm never, I'm always, how do I phrase this? I'm always surprised by the level of sophistication of a lot of the social engineering attacks that we see, and just like the amount of time that's invested in establishing trust with a particular community before actually attempting to deploy something malicious. That it never ceases to surprise me or amaze me. One thing that I often find really fascinating in terms of like APT tooling is, and this is maybe a bit more specific to Chinese threat actors because I spend a lot of time researching them. But I think prior to coming into this industry, I kind of had this idea that a lot of APT groups or even sophisticated threat actors were kind of more working along the lines of that like stereotypical few people in a basement grabbing stuff off the dark web, deploying stuff through the dark web, and it's really interesting how a lot of these groups actually operate just like a typical software engineering firm. So we see a lot of APT-based malware coming out of China that is actually developed by contractors, typically within China. And if you look at their operations, and you know, a lot of the time that's because they've sort of failed somewhere along the way with operational security, and you're able to actually access some of their documentation. They really are structured like your typical software engineering company. They are iterating on their products. They might be using version control. They've got different teams that are responsible for different access or for different aspects of different features. And in many of these cases, even if the malware itself isn't the most sophisticated thing you've ever seen, it's not something like a zero-day exploit that's being used or integrated into an application-based malware. It's still really fascinating just how legitimized this whole process is for something very malicious. You could, out of context, to just look at it as though it was an app developed like any other benign company with decent resourcing and a decent number of personnel. So I always find that really interesting. It's, I think, something that maybe not everybody is aware of unless you're kind of more entrenched in this space.
And
Yeah,
I wanted to,
yeah, go for it, Justin. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, sorry, I wanted to add to that because it's, Christina highlighted it with Chinese APTs especially. But we see it across a lot of the major APTs. In Iran, it's the same boat, right? Like there's Domestic Kitten is a family that a lot of people have heard of for Iranian mobile malware that targets dissidents primarily and activists. And that's developed by a software development organization called Jelva Sanat. The Rana Institute, which is linked to APT 39, another Iranian APT. Is, they used a private development firm. A lot of the malware that we track in Russia, it's the same. So especially for mobile malware, for APTs, it does seem to be a lot of use of external contractors. So when we start to dig down into who's behind these attacks, a lot of times it's a company. It's not necessarily a shady government organization. We might figure that out down the line,
right?
But a lot of times that ends up being a private entity operating within that country.
That's a really good point. It's an interesting thing to think about. Like when you eventually my guess is you kind of get to that point where it's like, wait a second, this is actually maybe tied to something sort of government funded or sponsored or something like that. Sort of interesting thread to pull on. So I want to shift a little bit. Let's start talking about kind of the meat of the topic today. Really focusing all of what we've already discussed on the enterprise, right? So, Christina, I'll start with you, but in your opinion, both in sort of just your professional opinion, but also in fact, where are you seeing things happen that this type of activity, whether it's APTs themselves or APT-like activity, like we've talked about, sort of almost like this trickle-down effect, where is it really starting to play in the enterprise? And why is it shifted from kind of more nation-state backed stuff, for lack of a better word, to something that an enterprise team needs to really worry about?
So I sort of see it as kind of happening for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think we have always had some APTs that sort of, like, for lack of a better expression, double dipped in state-sponsored espionage as well as participating in financially motivated campaigns. So, we're going to be talking about APT 41 a little bit later. They're a really good example of a certain threat actor that has been very involved in state-sponsored activity, but also has been allowed to to basically do their own thing and conduct very financially motivated campaigns against private sector and other industries that you wouldn't necessarily expect that would be tied to state-sponsored activity. And we've seen this with some other Chinese and North Korean threat actors as well. And then I think, when we kind of talk about like APT adjacent activity, I think cyber criminal organizations are recognizing that there is a lot of money to be made through these kinds of campaigns that can be relatively low risk, especially if you're operating in an area where, even if you're indicted, unless you go to that country, not a whole lot happens. And so I think they are starting to look at the successes that have been attained by some of the more state-sponsored, truer like APT activity campaigns, and using some of that to kind of influence the way that they're launching their own campaigns. And then, it sort of, it just continues that way. A certain cyber criminal organization or an APT group that is perhaps operating in a way that is not necessarily state sponsored, but they've been allowed to kind of participate in something on the side. They have success, it's reported. Other organizations see that success, and then they continue to piggyback off of that and learn from each other through probably what is mostly public reporting. And so I think that's why we're seeing less, we're still seeing so much of the kind of like true APT nation state sponsored activity, but I think we are seeing these broader organizations, these threat actors that are piggybacking off of that and finding ways to really use a lot of those tactics and techniques for financially motivated campaigns.
Yeah, and the fact is, it seems like these days it doesn't really matter. It's like there's a particular industry that's under attack or anything like that. It's just really they're targeting whoever they can, right? I mean, that at least that's how it looks from my end. I'm not on the front lines of research, but yeah, that's sort of what I'm reading. And Justin, I'll toss this over to you. I know that you've talked recently at Black Hat, Falcon, a couple other cool events. What have you, when you kind of blow it out a little bit, what Christina was just talking about, and look at it more from like really a broader data security strategy for an organization? Like how does that, what Christina just talked about, kind of play into this? We obviously have some recent examples of like the MGM and Caesars attacks a couple weeks ago, which maybe we can get into. But where does it really play into the data security strategy, rather than just like really focusing even just specifically on mobile?
So I think like those are great examples of attacks, right, that were initially enabled by mobile and by probably the simplest mobile attacks that you can think of, which are SMS phishing, and something that we're all familiar with because we all get them at this point and have dealt with them and are kind of surprised that people fall for it, but they do. So obviously this is linked to like the kill chain. When you look at how those attacks occurred and you see that you can stop it at the very beginning of it with the SMS phishing, what we see is that those same techniques are used by APTs. And you mentioned like that they're not targeting a specific vertical. In reality, they are, but there's a couple of other goals here to keep in mind when it comes to targeting an individual enterprise for data. There's financial goals, like you want to, steal money, you want to steal secrets from an organization and use that to further your goals, whether as a nation or whether it's for individual financial gain as a threat group. One thing that you can see is, let's take a lesson from the desktop side of the house. So if you look at the war in Ukraine right now, and you saw that the way that the cyber attacks evolved there, where essentially the ransomware groups that are primarily Russian-speaking ransomware groups, many of them that aligned with Russia, were essentially acting as proxies for their intelligence organizations and their APTs. Take that as one example. Take the example that North Korea is funding a lot of their nuclear program and their government through cryptocurrency. Take the example that China has allowed a lot of financial threats to occur without any kind of like remediation or punishment, and they're allowing groups like APT-41 to operate with impunity. All of these, if you like take a step back and look at it from a geopolitical aspect as well, you're seeing that these are a lot of countries that are under sanctions. And when you're under sanctions, you need a way to make money. And if you have a really tough time making money and you have a way to steal cryptocurrency or to steal data from an organization and use it to fund your government, then that's a great method forward. So for me, that's an important thing to keep in mind, because we're not only seeing this kind of funneling of these threat groups where the criminal threat groups and the APTs are starting to combine forces or share tactics, share TTPs, share malware in some cases, and targeting. But we're also seeing that happen on, even when we discuss like zero-day markets. Like a lot of people are concerned about Pegasus, right? But if you ever have a conversation with a customer about Pegasus, one of the first things they'll talk to you about is this only targets civil society. why would I care? All I see is news reports about it targeting journalists. I can tell you if an organization is willing to spend $1 million to target a journalist for national security purposes, which national security can be defined any way a country leadership wants, then they'd be willing to target, business secrets. They'd be willing to get information that will, improve their economy, allow them to operate, better. And we've seen detections on customers with advanced spyware who are not involved in journalism or activism whatsoever. Russia has its own zero-day market now that they're funding through, Russian funds, and they pay up to 20 million for full exploit chains now for mobile. So you see that this is like a huge market, and it's not going away, and it's shifting along geopolitical lines. Like I know I'm getting a little bit out in the weeds here, but I like to think strategically about these things and kind of look at the direction that things are going writ large. And I think if you start to look at the way that these organizations are combining forces to target enterprises as well, then there's definitely a trend here that you can see on the desktop side. And of course, that transitions to mobile. None of this exists in a vacuum. It's all connected. The victim is the ultimate target.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think the victim is the ultimate target. That sort of sums it all up. And also, please do get in the weeds. I love listening to you and hear you guys talk about all this stuff. I think it's so interesting. So, all right. So we mentioned APT 41 before. I mentioned at the start that you guys obviously were the ones who found some mobile spyware, surveillanceware tied to it. So I want to move on to that. Kind of let you guys run people maybe through like how you came across it, what APT 41 is, what they've kind of done historically, what your process was discovering it, and the two pieces of malware which we named Dragon, Egg, and Worm Spy, how we got to that. And then afterwards, we'll hand it over to Christina to do a quick run through the Research Console, and then we'll wrap things up after that. But I'll kind of open this up to you guys if you want to take folks through kind of the history of all this and how we got to where we are with this discovery. Just, I guess it was now only like 6 weeks ago or so.
Sure. We'll wait for each other. I'll give like a little bit of background. So APT 41 is a Chinese threat actor, state sponsored. They have been around for quite a while. They've been active since around 2012. They have been connected to cyber criminal activity targeting dozens of different areas of industry, video game companies, universities, think tanks, healthcare industry, as well as foreign governments, and targeting pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, as well as politicians. And they've also been tied to the compromising of various organizations in over 100 countries. They have been active. They are quite a prolific threat actor and have been tied to a lot of very interesting campaigns. And then I think what also makes the story kind of interesting is that in 2019 and 2020, the US Department of Justice indicted 5 individuals that they associated with APT 41. A few of these individuals are actually listed as part of like in leadership positions for a Chinese company called Chengdu 404, or Chengdu 404 Network Technology Company Limited. We'll call them Chengdu 404. And it basically charged these individuals with conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, fraud, identity theft, access device fraud, like a whole bunch of different things. And there was a public report with a lot of information about, some indicators from these various campaigns that were interesting for us and helped fuel some of the investigation that led to this discovery. So I'll kick it over to Justin because he was the one that found the link between some of these samples and some IOCs that came from that document.
Sure. So I don't know how interesting it'll be to people how we first found this, but essentially, kind of to boil it down, this was an exercise in looking at tactics that other threat actors were using to target mobile devices and searching on some of the specific strings that they were using within our corpus of data. So if anyone's not familiar, basically we ingest a ton of applications, and our threat intelligence team has to scroll through these like 270 million applications and figure out the 5 that are malicious and tied to an APT nation state. It's definitely like a needle in a haystack problem. So you have to start with some criteria. And in this case, the criteria was misuse of a certain API that was being done by a Vietnamese threat actor group called Ocean Lotus. And this is a few years ago. So they were using this functionality called set UID mode, started hunting around applications that were using that, and noticed that there were some specific applications that had routing tools built into the application, which is unusual to see, especially given what the applications were, which were pretending to be system level applications for, I believe, Samsung devices, right, Christina, the badge provider?
Yeah.
Yeah. And basically looking at the network connections that those applications were making. So we look for what's called command and control. It's how malware receives commands from a server, so from the actor controlling it, and how it exfiltrates data from the victim, where it sends the data to. And we found connections to a domain called UMISEN, which was actually listed in the Department of Justice indictment. And funny enough, one of the hackers who were indicted, they were on the whois information for that domain. So if anyone's not familiar, when you register a domain on the internet, you have a certain amount of registration information that goes with that. That's called whois information, and it has different selectors or identifiers that you put in for various portions of that registration. So in this case, we saw the hacker's name, having registered the domain, we saw their email, etc. So that's kind of how we made the initial connection and found this.
And I mean, we see this pretty frequently with, especially surveillanceware, where the threat actor will try and pretend to be some kind of system level application or something that you would expect to exist by default on the operating system. So yeah, like Justin was saying, badge provider, what that system level app technically does is it's like the legitimate version is responsible for displaying the little number that you would see over an app icon to say you have 3 notifications or something like that. So, if you are somebody who is perhaps a little bit more paranoid and you look through all the various applications that are installed on your device, if you saw something that looked like a system level application and didn't necessarily see it as installed as a third-party application, it's something you could scroll right by. And so we see a lot of surveillance tooling that's deployed by threat actors that is something like badge provider or Android service, or these kind of nondescript names that make it more difficult to really pinpoint where the malware is coming from.
Got it. Very cool. All right, so Christina, I'm going to kick it over to you. We can show folks a little bit about a little bit in our console, how we might find something like this, a little demonstration, if you will. So I'll let you
Sure.
take it away on that.
Sounds good. Oh, I just got logged out. Of course, let me log back in.
Classic.
All right, let me share my screen. I don't know if I have presenter mode.
Oh, whoops, my bad. Yep, that's on me.
No worries, just wasn't sure if I was missing the button.
All right, here we go. Here we go. All right. There we go.
Perfect.
Should be good to go.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so can you see the research console?
Looks great.
Perfect. Excellent. So yeah, this is our research console. This is, pretty much what we're using when we're threat hunting within our data set for malware. So, we're talking about this APT 41 indictment document and kind of how we came across these samples. one of the interesting things about being able to search through our data set is being able to look for dynamic activity and connections to certain domains and IP addresses. And so as Justin mentioned in that DOJ document, when they were talking about a lot of the activity tied to APT 41, there was this discussion about the umisen.com domain and a subdomain specifically that was being used by the threat actor vpn2.umisen.com. So let's say that we are looking through various IOCs and we want to look for something that has potentially come from APT 41 and pivoting from some of the indicators that are tied from this document. And then, also looking for some capabilities in applications in our data set that we might consider suspicious. We kind of tend to combine a lot of these capabilities together to give us a better chance of finding something that is surveillanceware or some kind of surveillance activity. So we can start off and we can start looking for these capabilities. These tend to be things like being able to read SMS messages, being able to record audio, that kind of stuff. So if we start with, let's start with capabilities. So we got this autocomplete function, which is very handy. Capability type, capabilities.capability type, and we're gonna start off with, say, read SMS. Oops. And let's do another one, capabilities, capability type, read location, and let's say capabilities, capability type, record audio, and say capabilities, capability type again, access camera. So I mean, these capabilities aren't necessarily guaranteed to give us something that's truly surveillanceware. I mean, half of our social media applications and messaging applications require these permissions and actually do a lot of this stuff. But it is kind of a nice starting point to be able to see whether the application and what it's claiming to do really requires access to these certain features of your device and should actually be able to run these various activities. So for example, if you're looking at something that is a wallpaper or flashlight application and it's attempting to read your SMS messages, there's maybe not a legitimate reason for that. So these capabilities, kind of all combined can be an indication that something is maybe not quite above board. So this is just sort of like a basic way to kind of cut down on some of the other more benign applications that could pop up while we're hunting. In this case, we're going to get more specific, and we're going to look for 2 IP addresses that are tied to both the umisen.com and vpn2.umisen.com subdomains. So let's do AP addresses.address. And we'll start off with the subdomain. So that one is 172.221.254.252, and we're going to just basically say, give us anything that is talking or has talked to this IP address or the IP address that is used for just like the base umisen.com domain, and that one is 121.42.149.52. Okay, so we've got these guys combined together, so give us either or, and then give us everything that actually has these capabilities as well. So we can hit search. It's going to think for a bit and go through.
This is a live demo moment of truth.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you have to query 280 million mobile applications.
Yeah, exactly. It's like playing the Jeopardy music in my head.
I know, me too.
By default. Oh, awesome. Okay. So we get back 14 different samples, and as you can see, they've all got the same name, badge provider, and they've got this package name, com.sec.android.provide.badge. So these are these early samples of Worm Spy that we're pretending to be the badge provider system application. I mean, we can see here, of course, that these are all already classified as worm spy. You know, in the moment when you're doing this this initial threat hunting exercise and you haven't found the malware yet, of course, these wouldn't necessarily say that they're anything. But we can see when they were acquired, and we can go in and look and see when they were actually developed as well. So if we go into the instance page for this guy and we look at the metadata, we can see that they were packaged in 2017. And a lot of these samples were, there's good overlap with the IP address that was the resolving IP for the EMISEN domain, and when these samples were actually packaged and signed and presumably distributed. So that kind of lets us know that this is truly tied to APT 41 activity. And so this is kind of one batch of the applications that we had tied to APT 41. These are some of the older ones. Now, as Hank said, there is another family called Dragon Egg. And this family we found through basically pivoting off of these early samples. So if we go into, or these earlier samples, I'll say. So if we go into we're still in the metadata here, and we look at certificate information, we have details about the signing certificate that was used for these samples. Now, sometimes what we see is a compromised key, which means that the signing certificate has been compromised, or it's a debug signing certificate. It can be used by a whole ton of people. You could have 500,000 applications that are using the same signing certificate. That doesn't really give us much insight into whether a developer was responsible for creating all of the applications that are tied to that particular signing certificate. If it's something that's unique and we haven't seen it compromised, or it's not a debug certificate, then that gives us a pretty good idea of what other applications this developer has also produced. So that was the way that we found the Dragon Egg samples. So if we look at these values here, we want to check for a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to go into the behaviors tab, and I'm looking for a classification that we call compromised key. This is a detection that says, hey, this particular sample is, as you guessed, using a compromised key. So pivoting off of the signing certificate for that sample isn't really going to help us. We're just going to get a whole ton of false positives, things that are not necessarily tied to the threat actor that we're investigating. But in this case, we don't actually see that. So if we go back over here into the signing certificate and we look at this SVKI hash, we can actually click on this guy and it'll kick off another query for us. Now, what this is doing is it's looking for a hash, this SPKI, pronounced spooky. It's basically the subject, public key, and information. That's where you get the SPK and I. It's the content of the certificate. And so we can use this hash value to look for other samples that are tied to the worm spy samples. So while this guy's loading, I'm going to show you over here. We have, under the package name, we have, this is the spooky hash here, like 6A72, CAA, etc., 8C0, C77. That's one that's currently running. We can combine all of these and do like one big query to see what other samples were signed by any of these other certificates. So I'm just going to look for any kind of unique ones that we can plop open. We go D8, this guy. We opened the B1 one. I don't think we opened this one yet. All right. So we can hop into these individual instances and see here we have a compromised key assessment. All right, we're not going to bother with this guy. His signing certificate's compromised. It's just going to throw us off. Go into behaviors. Excellent, no compromised key. We can grab this value. So I'm going to grab the hash. I'm just going to copy it. And I'm going to actually, so we've got some stuff pop up for this particular query, but I'm just going to combine these. So it's just a bit faster. We don't have to wait for each one to run. Okay, so we've got that guy. We go into this sample, also not a compromised key. Excellent. We can use this hash value. Copy this guy. We're just going to do this for any of the samples that aren't compromised keys. All right, this is a compromised key. We'll skip that. This one is not. You could also do this with the signature hash. This would, or the signer hash, this would work too. It's just a little bit easier to see from this original results page, which ones are unique that we haven't, oops, grabbed yet.
And I was going to say for this, for iOS applications, we do the same thing with team IDs, for example. So if you want to look at a team ID for a developer that's been developing malware and see what else they have, it's also a very good technique for that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we're almost done. I think this is the last one. Yep. All right, no compromised key. Copy. Okay, so now if we run this search, we'll see what other samples we might get back. And so this is helpful because not only are we looking for other malware that isn't necessarily worm spy, but it could also just show us other worm spy samples that didn't come back in that initial query, because sometimes threat actors are changing infrastructure. So maybe in 2017 they were talking to the umisen.com domain or subdomain, but then eventually they switched. So it's kind of nice to be able to pivot off of things you already know about a particular lead. Okay, so most of these, as we can see, are worm spy, but then we've got this guy here, which of course we already have the coverage in place. So you can see that it's Dragon Egg. But presumably, if this guy, wasn't part of the initial results set for worm spy, this would be a new sample that we could dive into and look at possibly new strings or new infrastructure and have some confidence that it is very likely developed by the same developer or threat actor in this case as the other samples we looked at. And that is the case with this. So Dragon Egg is tied to APT 41 as well. It's a bit different from the worm spy samples. It basically relies on extensive modularity to download multiple jar files that are responsible for kind of initializing surveillance functionality. One of the interesting things about this kind of group of applications, they were developed a bit later, and some of the logging messages are referring to things like the forensics tooling. And so we typically see that in applications or malware that have been developed by contractors, especially coming out of China, where they are not necessarily referring to the activities that they're conducting as surveillance or spyware. They really are considering their tooling to be forensics. Legitimate forensics tooling. So that was kind of interesting for this guy. But yeah, that's an example of finding these samples in our data set and working with the Research Console.
Cool. That was awesome. Thank you, Christina. Very cool. See, Justin, anything to add there? Or you think she pretty much nailed it?
No, always nails it.
Always does.
Yeah, the only other thing I guess I would highlight is like one of the initial things that Christina put in there which was the network connections. We have our own dynamic analysis, static analysis, and those network connections, like a lot of times on the TI team, one thing that we're looking at primarily is how does mobile malware overlap with desktop malware? Because we see cross-platform campaigns all the time that have shared infrastructure, whether that's shared C2 or whether they're hosting both desktop and mobile malware on the same site. And we typically identify that in our threat reporting because that's something that customers want to know, right? They want to know that if they're being targeted with desktop malware, do they need to be concerned that their phones are being targeted as well? Or do they just need to implement protections against these desktop-based threats? So with this, a lot of times we start our hunts with desktop malware activity that other vendors might identify or cybersecurity researchers that are tied to an APT, and we'll look at those network connections. We'll kind of broaden the infrastructure, look at the actual infrastructure, do some research, get as many domains and IPs together as we can, and then pop them into the tool and see what comes out and whether it looks malicious or not. It's a very common way to do threat hunting, but it also shows kind of that, how they're using those cross-platform attacks. And with that, the cool thing is like, once you verify that, you could do it from the same site. If you see something malware in your system that's on mobile, you can implement protections across your security apparatus for desktop threats as well. So you take the C2, you take the IPs, domains, etc. Pop them in your scene, pop them in your IDS.
Mhm. And
It's
that
really helpful
all,
for, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead. No, go ahead, Christina. Yeah.
Just one quick thing about that as well. Even attribution in threat intelligence is really hard. So if we've gotten lucky in the past and been able to attribute a particular malware family to a threat actor with high confidence, sometimes being able to rely on those detection, network detection events for another malware family that perhaps has better operational security, it's harder to necessarily pinpoint who the threat actor is that's behind it. But maybe they messed up somewhere and they shared infrastructure with another malware family that we already knew a fair bit about. That was the case with like Bad Bazaar and Double Agent. We wrote about them back in November 2022. Overlapping infrastructure there allowed us to get a sense of the fact that they were likely the same threat actor or part of the same APT group.
Got it. Very cool. All right, we've got just a few minutes left here. So I think what we'll do is we had one question come in that we'll get to at the end here, but I'm actually going to just share my screen here. Well, we'll just go over a couple kind of key takeaways here. Let me just bring myself back to being a presenter. Sorry, Christina. All right, so I'll pop this up. All right, cool. Let me make this full screen. There we go. Okay, so what can we really do with all of this? This has all been super helpful, Justin, Christina, as always. And so there are kind of five key points I thought we would cover here. The first being kind of sort of the obvious point here that we've been mentioning over and over again, that this is not, these tactics aren't something that are just reserved for these advanced nation state level attacks. I've used the term trickle down a little bit here, where we're seeing some of these groups use some of these more advanced tactics. We're even, as was mentioned earlier, even seeing some APT groups themselves doing this sort of double dipping. So I think this is sort of representing this fundamental shift in who's being targeted and how they're being targeted. The second thing here is that we're really seeing a lot more with the mobile device being targeted as that initial vector of compromise, which is interesting. We think about some of this sort of highly advanced malware, spyware, surveillanceware, whatever it may be, like Pegasus, that really rely on compromising the device. But like Justin mentioned, some of the attacks that we've seen in the last couple of weeks have actually relied on these really basic functionalities. Social engineering through text, through any app with the messaging functionality can be used to deliver a phishing link. Swipe those credentials, and then the attacker spins around their chair, logs in on their laptop or desktop to a SaaS app that holds valuable data, and then then you're running into a pretty serious issue there. Third one here, looking at all the data that Christina presented to us, even just in this one example, I think it's proof that mobile threat intel isn't just a nice to have anymore. It's really becoming a need to have. You think about how much importance we put on that more traditional threat intelligence for traditional endpoints, right? Laptops, desktops, servers, so on. And without, in my opinion, I think without mobile threat intel to really round that out, you're basically choosing to live with a level of risk and this sort of significant blind spot, especially as we're seeing more and more attacks targeting, as I mentioned, mobile as that initial vector. The last two here, talking about data security strategies themselves, and also extending those detection and response capabilities to mobile is pretty critical. You think about how much we have folks working from their mobile devices every day. In my opinion, why wouldn't you secure it the same way you're securing, again, those kind of traditional endpoints? Those devices have just as much access to data in SaaS apps. Every app has a mobile component now, or a mobile mobile experience. And when you think of EDR, right, at its core, it's the ability to detect and respond to threats on endpoints, right? Endpoint detection response, and that really shouldn't exclude mobile. So you add the research aspect of that, kind of from the admin experiences, as Christina showed us, and it's pretty, it makes sense to fold that into those existing workflows you already have with traditional EDR, and I think it's actually pretty forward thinking to include mobile, especially as we see more attacks coming through that vector. So that's all that I had. We did have one question come in. I think should be a good. It's a good thing to chat about. We're obviously talking more about the enterprise stuff here, but someone was curious if there were any open source tools that we would suggest to check for a breach on a personal cell phone. I know that the Lookout consumer app does something similar to that. Justin, Christina, I don't know if you have any other particular suggestions there.
Now,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, presumably this is not a breach of the accounts that are on the device, but rather a breach of the device itself. There's two different types of device breaches if we really break it down. There's a breach that results in a jailbreak or rooting of the device, which breaks the sandbox and allows access to different types of data. And then there's a malicious application that might have ended up on your phone, which won't necessarily have the same level of access, depending on your OS version, et cetera. And then there's, you can have an individual account breach that you can go to Have I Been Pwned and see if it's on there. That'd be like the #1 first stop shop. Like Hank mentioned, F-Secure, which got the Lookout application. Obviously, all our detections go into there. So I think that's a great place to start. It's free. And you can check, and it has all of our research goes into the detections that are built into that. If you are concerned with more advanced targeting, like your phone has been remotely jailbroken, you're a high-risk person, and you think you might have gotten hit by something like Pegasus or Predator, you can still use our application. You could go and use something like MBT, that's M as in Mike, Victor, Tango, produced by Amnesty International. So they allow you to look at like iCloud backups and use basic indicators of compromise for advanced spyware. And that's an NGO that can help people who are targeted by these types of threats. But typically, we trust our own detections and our own research as well. So I'm happy to recommend it.
Yeah, me too.
All right, cool. All right, guys. Well, that's we're just about up on the hour here. I don't see any other questions that came in. So Justin, Christina, thank you as always for joining on this. This has been awesome. And for the folks who logged in to watch, thank you so much. Like I mentioned, we will be sending out a recording of this in the next day or two. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.